Let's get into it. So thank you guys for stopping by. We have a lot we're going to cover. So thank you for joining the 2023 year in review, cyber edition. We're going to talk about a variety of different topics, but the entire purpose of this is to come together and reflect on the year that was, look ahead to ensure readiness, and really think through where we are today and how we can prepare for the year ahead. And so we are joined by four incredible panelists. I'll break down who we have, a little bit of background so we can jump right in, the format, topics of discussion, and what you can expect, and then we'll run right into it. And so in no particular order, we're joined by Hussein Sharaf, co-founder and CEO of CloudForce. They are the leading force in Microsoft Cloud. Mr. Bilal Baisa, Chief Information Security Officer for National Technical Information Service under the U.S. Department of Commerce. Erik Dominguez, Senior Manager, Pen Testing and FedRAMP with Emagine IT. And Chris Hughes, co-founder and president of Acquia, and also the host and author of the Resilient Cyber podcast. And so we have a combination of the federal perspective, the private perspective, cloud, software supply chain, and everything in between. Here's what we're going to do today for the next 40 minutes or so, okay? For us to effectively reflect on 2023, I actually want to start by anchoring where were we this time last year? What did the end of 22 look like? What were we thinking about looking ahead at 2023? Then we'll start to shift into key topics and setting up kind of how this year impacted areas like artificial intelligence, software supply chain security, vulnerability management, zero trust, continuous authorization, FedRAMP. We're going to run this in a way where I'd rather go a mile deep in topics than kind of skirt on the surface. So those topics may adjust if we get in rhythm. We want this to be more of a free-flowing discussion than it being, one question for everybody, and it's run from there. Then we'll have time for questions. So we do want to earmark at least 10-15 on the back end. Sound good? All right. You guys see me moving paper around. All right, so hey, this time last year, here's what was top of mind, right? The conversation around AI was starting to develop and accelerate at a much more rapid pace. The Log4j vulnerability incident took place, which brought software supply chain really top of mind for a lot of people that maybe weren't as focused on it. The limited adoption of continuous authorization, FedRAMP, a lot of those things were moving. Chris, I'd love if you could actually kick us off here. If you take us back to December last year, for you, you're heavily in software supply chain security, FedRAMP, vulnerability management. Where was your head at December last year when you were looking out on what you expected out of 2023?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on some of the key themes there. Obviously, we had an initial memo, 2218, come out from the Office of Management and Budget talking about secure self-attestation and vendors selling to the federal government aligned with the secure software development framework and like that. Obviously, we'll touch on this, but there are subsequent memos that came out. A lot of folks, kind of looking at the federal sector as an enticing target with economic headwinds in the commercial space. So FedRAMP became even more of a hot topic, but people kind of cringing with the time, cost, and commitment of FedRAMP and, kind of legacy processes. So we'll get to the FedRAMP modernization memo, I'm sure. But we did have the FedRAMP Authorization Act that came out. And then you talked about software supply chain security, everything from Log4j to SolarWinds. We saw a lot of activity this year with Microsoft and Okta and many, many more that impacted the federal government as well. So those topics were all top of mind, along with, just looking at the progress of the federal zero trust efforts within the Cybersecurity Executive Order. The federal zero trust strategy that came out, all the respective federal civilian agencies, as well as the DoD, kind of publishing their own, federal zero trust strategy and plan on how to go about making, progress on that journey. So we got a lot to unpack and a lot of cyber topics to dive into here.
A lot going on. Shifting from the private side, and obviously, Chris, you've spent time on both sides, both within active duty and service and the private side. Bilal, from the federal point of view, what was top of mind for you last year? I know you spent time in zero trust in a lot of different areas over at NTIS, but when you were looking out at 23, what was top of mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think such as the topics yourself and Chris kind of brought up along those same lines. Chris brought up a lot of the executive orders, memorandums that were passed down from Congress and OMB. Supply chain, obviously, the forefront of everybody's minds, especially with Log4j. If you take a couple steps back, even with SolarWinds, how that did not only government, but the private sector as well, and even if now we're going a little bit farther beyond that. But I'm sure we all recall the Spectre meltdown, right? So as Chris mentioned, it brought the whole supply chain risk management into the forefront of everybody's mind. Also, as a subsequent act to that, the Binding Operational Directive 2201 that was passed last year, and the publishing of the known exploitable vulnerabilities. Chris mentioned the Log4j, you mentioned Log4j. Obviously, that was part of the catalog that was produced by CISA. But even going into this year, the continuance and the growth of that catalog and the vulnerabilities, right? Those are vulnerabilities that have been known to be exploited in the wild. And so the timeline to remediate those vulnerabilities now on paper, a lot shortened.
Hussein, when you were kicking off and walking into 23, obviously you live in cloud, live in Azure, whether it's moving large organizations to the cloud and helping them just get best value out of it. What was top of mind for you at the close of last year?
Yeah, I mean, the close of last year obviously was a bit crazy with the emergence of ChatGPT on the scene, and everybody just being so blown away by what it could do. But in relation to security, my mind immediately went to, this thing is going to be used to write malicious code at scale and do it in a way where, you can make slight adjustments to that code to really get around a lot of the protections available to customers and have it do that a million times over in a day, right? And so that's immediately where my mind went. Obviously, thankfully, it hasn't gone as horribly this year as I might have feared. And obviously, I think OpenAI and Microsoft have built protections into their solutions to prevent people from using their tools in those ways. But at the same time, there's other open source models that have also hit the scene, a lot of copycat models, which may not be as good as GPT. But you can download them and you can play with them and you can adjust them, right, in ways that could allow for malicious code to be written. And so I'm definitely still concerned. I'm curious to hear what the rest of the panelists think about how, the emergence of generative AI is going to impact, the cyber landscape moving forward, both from the malicious actor side as well as, the folks that are trying to keep everybody safe.
Yeah. Perfect segue. Erik, you obviously live in FedRAMP, in pen testing, red team, blue team, purple team. Talk to me about what was top of mind at the back end of last year before you turned the corner.
I would say the biggest thing, from our side was Log4j. That was huge because, exploitable vulnerabilities, as Bilal touched on, we have, exploits in the wild. So while we were doing testing in FedRAMP and, just doing actual true pen tests, we saw Log4j pop up a lot. So it was, it honestly became low-hanging fruit for us at that point, for, clients to, address it, narrow it down and stuff like that. Because an unfortunate reality is, and I'm going to throw a little bit of a dark and luminous, I guess, on this. A lot of clients like to ignore those things. It is what it is. There are, clients that prefer just to have put their head in the sand and ignore it and hope that it doesn't come in. But that's the purpose of red teaming and penetration testing, is we can show, hey, this is real. We can exploit it. You need to address it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, look, I think
to follow up on that, Jeremy, if you don't mind, I mean, just Log4j, and Erik, I'm sure you can attest to this, just because of such wide use of Apache, right, across all types of software. Log4j really became an issue, not only, like I said earlier, across government sector, but private sector as well. I mean, Erik mentioned, it was pretty much low-hanging fruit for him and his team to come in and identify those vulnerabilities. But this was a pretty vast issue across, the entire cybersecurity realm.
Yep, big time. I mean, we saw it pop up a lot, and as soon as it came out, we actually, for a lot of our clients, I remember I set up a demo of setting up VMs and everything to demonstrate how easy it was to exploit and how you could do it, what you could do. And I think that plays a big role, because a lot of companies don't understand how significant it is. And when you can spin up, a couple of VMs and demonstrate that a bad guy can come in, take over one of your servers, and you can do it in the span of 5 minutes, it really sets home, and I don't mean to get ahead of myself here, Jeremy, but Hussein, what you were talking about earlier with the malicious code and everything, I've actually done that. So that'd be a good talking point for us to move into. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I didn't want to lose that.
So it's a perfect segue. So I think AI has been a topic everybody has been very interested in, and it touches everything because of both front-end application as well as kind of what we don't see behind the surface, and also the use cases that go beyond just what's on a network, but just how people incorporate it into the way they do their job. There was this Samsung incident where somebody was working as an engineer and was like, "Hey, I can maybe optimize this." They copy and pasted it, put it in ChatGPT, and then realized after they hit go, we have a problem. Right. I think people they're using it as a thinking partner and to support the knowledge effort, but it also is something where there's both a lot of optimism and excitement, a bit of lack of governance. And so we're at this interesting point in time where I think we're starting to see the consumer facing excitement. ChatGPT was like, oh, this is real. But then all these other things come to light as far as what do we do? And so I'd love to go back to you, Hussein, to kick things off. I know one of the things that's top of mind from your standpoint is also the democratization of AI, right? These LLMs provide the ability for many people that may not have had access or the ability to leverage these type of capabilities to bring it to the forefront. Where's your mindset at today, and how did 2023 influence the development of the role AI plays when it comes to that initiative?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I've been doing a lot of talking about this subject. I actually just did a talk with Microsoft last week at a summit for AI for education. And I think, ChatGPT was not necessarily new technology, right? OpenAI has been around for a long time. They had many previous iterations of the GPT models, none that were necessarily as impressive as the more recent models, but this is not new technology. But what is new is presenting it to a consumer in a way that a non-technical person can just jump in, single sign on with a Google account, and in 2 minutes they're chatting with this thing that sounds like a human. And very quickly, I think people realize, oh, this can do a lot of monotonous, tasks for me. It can get me started on a paper that I'm struggling to start. It can, help me draft this email that I don't know, quite how to draft. And being a Microsoft partner and being sort of heavily embedded in the Microsoft world, it's definitely exciting. It's an exciting time to be involved in that world with Copilot coming out now, and we're having a lot of conversations with customers in every industry, from education to state and local governments to commercial organizations, about how really what they're excited about is how much time they're going to get back from their knowledge workers that are going to be able to save. Some estimates are 40%, some are higher, of their, daily working time by not having to start from a blank page and having the assistance of generative AI embedded into, all of the productivity apps that we use every single day, from Outlook to Word to PowerPoint, right? And so there's a lot of excitement. And I think next year it's going to be a massive rush and a dash to get these capabilities not only deployed, but get users familiar and trained through a lot of change management is going to be required to get people up to speed.
Yeah, Hussein, I 110% agree with you. I honestly feel like 2024, you're going to start seeing prompt engineering for AI to be a viable skill that's going to be on resumes, honestly. Being able to manipulate AI, things like ChatGPT, is going to be at the forefront. And one thing that I found interesting here as of late is that there are ChatGPT accounts that are now popping up on eBay because they suspended, the influx of their premium account that's coming up just due to overwhelming demand. My fear around that is that people are looking at AI as just like a way to write an easy paper, for college or something along those lines. They're not seeing that well, they're only seeing the mile wide, inch deep aspect of AI. When you really dig into it and you start manipulating it, and you can go very, very deep into the specialization of what AI is capable of doing. And just like what you mentioned, spinning up those open source ones, I, you know, took it upon myself to see, how far down the rabbit hole does that go? And spun up a large language model on a cloud-based instance and was able to write ransomware. I obviously didn't release it, but wrote a Python script and ransomware that was undetectable by modern antivirus. And the total cost for me doing that was $1.50 in cloud resources. And it's just a matter of finding the OpenAI model that has all of those protections in place disabled. Then so you really get into that, how scary it can be.
Chris, I see you smiling and nodding along. Talk to me about what comes to mind, what you're thinking about as far as kind of how this applies to some of the areas you're focusing. I think it'd be very fascinating given, and we're going to talk software supply chain security vulnerability at a separate point, but I see you nodding along. I'd love to understand what goes to your mind.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the impact it's going to have on the federal ecosystem. Obviously, like there's commercial impacts and opportunities for innovators and companies and startups. But I just read a report yesterday saying that the GAO identified over 1,200 federal different use cases for AI. So it's safe to say federal agencies, Department of Defense, and so on are looking to use AI for a lot of different purposes. We've seen it cited by CISA in terms of safeguarding critical infrastructure, looking to use it for things like Copilot, triaging alerts, trying to minimize the alert fatigue and get to the identity or to the source of, what an actual incident is and kind of cut through a lot of the noise. We're seeing, opportunities to leverage it for good in terms of, writing secure code. We know that most developers don't want to take the time necessarily to focus on security. They find it a dreadful experience in some cases. So it can accelerate, writing secure code, secure software. We hear a lot about shifting security left, trying to build more secure by design products, for example, is a theme that we hear in the ecosystem right now. So there's an opportunity to leverage AI for those purposes as well as for the bad. But on the software supply chain front, obviously a lot of these, generative AI and AI platforms are going to be leveraged via the cloud. How many of those are actually FedRAMP? How many of them are being used right now via shadow SaaS usage, sites that haven't been vetted or approved by an agency, but are being consumed widely across the agency? Just go on, use your email, $1.50 like you talked about. You can quickly start using these services and, putting maybe sensitive agency data in there, whether it's PII, PHI, CUI, you name it. That's a concern. And then obviously the open source software aspect. One of the panelists here mentioned the open source models that are coming up here. There's a lot to be said about, how secure are those open source models, who's contributing to them, what are the components that are in those models in terms of open source software components and vulnerabilities. So we got a lot ahead of us in 2024. It's going to be some interesting times.
Yeah, I think all the panelists kind of hit the nail on the head, right? Hussein started off with, how he was leading into 2023, thinking about how AI could, adversely affect, cybersecurity or what have you. However, as Erik touched on, there are ways in which AI can assist in our day-to-day kind of security responsibilities. And I know Hussein touched on that as well. Chris also kind of hit the nail on the head. There are a wide variety of use cases AI could possibly assist with the government, right? So there are, how can AI assist with day-to-day tasks if you take an incident responder, so to speak, and the various tools that they're using and the various languages that they have to learn and how they query IOCs across various tools. Well, generative AI now, they can just, in plain English, query these various IOCs across all these systems, and now your incident responders not having to learn, multiple languages across various systems, or should you be migrating from one, tool set to the next? So just one use case in which, AI could positively affect the not only government but private industry as well. Erik also touched on something in terms of, how resumes moving forward might change from this, and I think there'll be an increase in not only internal training across federal and private sector as well, but however the need to perhaps additional expertise across the AI landscape as well.
Yeah, one quick comment just to Bilal's point, and I think it was Erik as well, is about the potential, security value-added activities of AI. Is like we know that it's a tool like any other technology. Malicious actors are going to look to exploit it and use it for nefarious purposes. So I think it's important as practitioners that we quickly look to adopt it too, and try to see how we can use it for purposes that we want to secure the enterprise, mitigate risk, and things like that. Otherwise, we run the risk of kind of hypothesizing on how it's going to be used maliciously, how should we protect it, et cetera, et cetera. And they're already going to be off looking to exploit it and use it for nefarious purposes. And then we're kind of back to the old bolted on security versus building it in. We need to be working hand in hand with engineers and developers from the onset of this adoption.
So
I think we can all agree it's AI is not going anywhere. Chris, I think you touched on it earlier. CISA is actually planning to release their own risk management framework, right, in regards to AI. So now everything that we've put in place in terms of security controls and protecting just, information systems in general, the laws, the regulations, the guidance, that's going to be now forthcoming in regards to AI as well.
Right. Yeah. Gentlemen, I have to agree 100% with both of you. One of the things that I like to say is AI is we're in the MySpace era if you compare it to social media. This is the very, very beginnings of it. Just like you mentioned, Bilal, there are already frameworks on it. MITRE already has an attack framework based around AI. So it is not going anywhere. And Chris, just like you said, it's either start using it and using it or get left behind because the bad guys are absolutely using it right now.
So a question to pull AI together, and then we'll move along and framing it through the lens of looking ahead at 24 to stakeholders. And I'll start with Hussein, because I think you brought up a great conversation. Copilot's obviously a huge effort that you've been folding in. And how do we balance distraction with innovation, given the state of where this is at today? Because where we're heading, there's significant upside to everybody's point of adoption and stabilization and incorporating it into a day-to-day. But there are also challenges associated with resources that go to this do not ultimately go to B, whatever that is. How do we prioritize where to focus the application of AI today versus what could be a distraction? Hussein, I'd love your take on it and what you're seeing through the lens of cloud and the conversations you're having. And then I'd love actually to go around the horn to get everybody's take from their purview.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The first 6 months of this year were interesting because there was a lot of hype, right? Like, there was a lot of people either excited about it or scared that it was going to kill us all, and it was nothing but hype on the news, hype in every blog post that you read was something about AI. And then I think the hype started to settle, and especially in the last 3 months, most of the conversations that we're having are with business leaders actually outside of IT who are trying to figure out what the use cases are. Because I think sort of like blockchain and a few other technologies that hit the scene in the last decade, oftentimes what we're finding is that it's the solution looking for a problem and not a problem looking for a solution. And so people are like, yeah, we need AI to solve our problems. We're like, but what problem, right? It's not just a catch-all. So I think there was a lot of distraction early on in the year. The last 3 months have been much more focused. So what we've been doing is leading workshops and tabletop exercises where we can really dig into what is this technology good at today, and how does that align with where you're going to see the most business value immediately for 2024. And I think we have narrowed in some really great use cases. Things as simple as just how much time and money do you waste answering help desk calls for the same thing over and over, right? Like 80-20 rule. 80% of the calls that the help desk gets are things that could be self-serviced if the user would just read, the document in SharePoint that tells them how to reset their password, right? And it sounds like such a simple and kind of elementary use case, but just put all that data behind a chatbot, right? And put OpenAI on top and allow your users to ask their questions in natural language and leverage the data that you already have that instructs people on what to do, right? And so that's a use case that I think is applicable to pretty much every industry, every company. The minute we tell them like, hey, look at how much money you're spending on like tier 1 help desk, like, let's cut that in half, let's cut that in a third, right? And so I think that's where we need to really, as leaders on this call, be steering our business customers to really think about, not just AI for everything, but like, let's start with low-hanging fruit, like where are we going to see the most business value next year?
I actually love that. I think oftentimes there's a lack of direct recognition to how it impacts the bottom line or the overall operating motion of the business, where you can see measurable impact on it versus the strategic vision that comes behind it of let's be innovative, let's be forward thinking. To that effect, if you can impact that one specific function, it's measurable at the end of the year. Chris, I'd love your take on it as well. How do we balance innovation and creativity and distraction through the lens of AI and as it distributes to your different areas of focus?
Yeah, I actually like I think it was Hussein's take there a moment ago, is like some of the customers or agencies or private sector organizations I encounter, it's like a hammer looking for a nail, right? You got to start with like, what are we looking to use it for? Like, same thing with cloud. I encounter people like, well, we need to be multi-cloud. Like, but have you built proficiency with a single cloud service provider? Same thing with AI. Have you started to adopt it for some specific purpose and driven business value from it? Are you starting to strategically use it, or are you just kind of saying, hey, we must do this because everyone else is doing it and all the headlines say that we need to be using it? So starting with like, what problems do you have at the agency or your organization? And then how can AI and some of the generative AI capabilities meet some of these problems or accelerate some of our time to outcome, as well as address some of the workforce factors. We know that agencies have a hard time attracting and retaining technical talent. Same thing on the security front. How can some of these automations and AI capabilities alleviate some of that strain as well? So I think it's just spot on in terms of not being distracted, of having specific use cases in mind that tie to business outcomes and starting there and iterating from there versus just trying to jump all in with no real strategic vision on how to go about it.
I'm going to jump to Bilal to keep us moving, and then I'm going to go to a new topic, not to cut you, Erik, but B, talk to me about what's top of mind as you look at from the federal perspective. How do you balance innovation, creativity, and also the distraction? Because the motion is different in the federal side, right? It's not as easy to do certain things. Maybe it's easier to do other things. What's your take?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've, all the panelists here on the call today have identified various use cases, right, for AI, not only for malicious purposes, but I think Chris mentioned, for as an example, the protection of critical infrastructure. I also threw out, some specific use case earlier. I think we also, as Chris and Hussein mentioned, have to identify what it is we're trying to tackle with AI as well. And then leading into that, again, as the regulations, the guidance is catching up and slowly being introduced, really looking into the protections we put around AI, right? As opposed to just blindly letting our customer base or consumer base use some of the generative AI methods, but who is really on the other end of that? I think Erik, or I think it was perhaps Hussein that mentioned, folks using generative AI to craft emails for them, right? Well, then now how are we protecting that sensitive data that we're storing, right? Not every email is meant for everyone on the other end of that. The protection around the security controls around the data that the generative AI is storing, a lot of those conversations now need to be had. And as we slowly kind of push out generative AI and AI just in general.
Transitioning to...
I was just going to add one more point to come back to your question, Jeremy. I think the distraction can be quelled by, how much additional time are all these folks going to have to do the business value stuff, right? It's really not necessarily about, what are all the cool use cases for AI and how is it going to change the business? It's, to me anyways, and I think a lot of people that I'm talking to, it's what could we be doing with that time instead, right? And so there is going to be some time and effort and, maybe some distraction to get some of these tools and services stood up inside of organizations. But immediately when you start seeing that business value of the time that all these people get back, right? Like whether it's a help desk technician or a threat hunter or whoever within the business, what could they be doing with that time that creates more value for that business? So it's really, I hate the term getting more with less, but it really is. You're getting more with less, right?
I think that also pulls it full circle into the change management component, where now somebody has 35% more time in their day. It doesn't mean it's an intuitive thing for them to fill with things they've never done in a way they've never done to create an outcome that maybe they haven't directly contributed to. So I think there's many factors in play, but it ties back to the business impact. So if we turn the page into software supply chain security, vulnerability management, SaaS has never been more top of mind. When we look at 2023, software supply chain attacks close to doubled, it looks like, depending on what reports you look at. A lot of focus on highlighting critical vulnerabilities in open source and APIs. SBOMs and AI-powered vulnerability management tools emerged as incredibly powerful defenses. But at the same time, while we look at automation, while we shift the left, there are natural challenges that are associated with this. Chris, I'll go to you to kind of kick things off. Frame up for me, how you entered 2023 when it came to your view on software supply chain security, vulnerability management, and how it developed, changed over the course of the year, and kind of where that places you today.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting time. I was in the process of wrapping up the book Software Transparency, which focused on software supply chain security. And I'm actually writing a second book on vulnerability management that comes out in May. But, it changed my perspective because I saw that we had this entire, for a long time, we had been focusing on our own organization, our own enterprise, and how can we secure things at our own enterprise, our own ecosystem, architectures, et cetera. While malicious actors increasingly realized rather than target one single entity or one organization, they could target a large proprietary software vendor. We all know the names of the big ones that have been hit, as well as widely used open source software components, and have a massive downstream impact across, hundreds of thousands of individuals or thousands of organizations or millions of people's data, things like that. And then honestly, the vulnerability management aspect is another critical piece. We talk about shifting left. So we throw everything in a pipeline, SaaS, infrastructure as code scanning, you name it, right? All those things are producing findings and essentially noise that we put in a massive spreadsheet and throw over the fence to development peers and tell them, hey, you can't go to production until you fix all the highs and criticals. The problem that I found out is like less than 5% of all CVEs or known vulnerabilities in the NIST National Vulnerability Database, for example, are ever exploited on an annual basis. So we need some context in terms of, like, I think it was Bilal mentioned SysSCEV, no exploited vulnerability list. So is it known to be exploited? Or there's also the EPSS, exploit prediction scoring system. Is it likely to be exploited in the next 30 days? Because without providing that context, we've been talking a lot about, freeing up time. Without providing context, we're just burying our peers in massive vulnerability list of things that may never be exploited, pose no risk to the organization, have no organizational context of the criticality of the system or data types involved or likelihood of exploitation of the vulnerability. And it's kind of antithetical to the push for DevSecOps and breaking down the silos.
Erik, I'll go to you on your thoughts. Obviously, you spent a lot of your time on both red team and offensive teams, but I think this plays a factor. It kind of ties things together. What are your thoughts on state of software supply chain security, vulnerability management, and kind of some of the things Chris is sharing?
Yeah, so and he brought up a really good point. Something that we struggle with on the red team, and that is the exploit of the likelihood of exploitability. Because when you, I guess the best way to put this is there is one aspect of like a standalone exploit on a vulnerability. And this does go back to supply chain and everything like that, because when you, from the red team perspective and penetration testing, we don't look at a singular vulnerability. We look at the big picture of everything, because there are situations to where a standalone vulnerability is a moderate, another standalone vulnerability is a moderate, but when you chain them together, you have a critical. We take two moderate vulnerabilities, chain them together, and suddenly we have a shell on a machine in no time. So when you combine it, it starts to, you get into that gray area of, all right, the likelihood of this being exploited by itself is one aspect, but if this other vulnerability over here pops up, then suddenly you have a critical on your hands. And that to me is the crux of something else that we get into, and that is penetration testing versus red team. Penetration testing is that snapshot, time and space right there. Red team is making the assumption that you go past that one defensive aspect. As we touched on at the beginning of the call, the FedRAMP has red team coming in 2024, and that's where a lot of my mindset is right now. But that's the reason, is because, as Chris mentioned, you have likelihood of exploitability, but we also have to 100% leverage that around what else is out there. So it becomes a chess match, honestly, that you plan against yourself. when you're dealing, especially with clients and things of that nature, because we have to figure out, all right, yeah, this vulnerability is, it's a critical in nature, but yet it has not been exploited in the wild. But if it does, and it's chained together with this vulnerability over here that we did find, it's super critical. You know, like you take over the entire domain with this type thing. So it's a razor's edge that you have to walk, honestly.
Yeah, Eric's kind of pointing to real quick. Eric's kind of pointing to the the phrase that we hear or should hear more often is like, defenders thinking lists while attackers thinking graphs. Like he's talking about chain vulnerabilities together and leading to exploitation and lateral movement, while we're just thinking in Excel documents and in singular vulnerabilities. And they're thinking about how to move across an ecosystem, get to critical assets or sensitive data.
That's very fascinating. Where I was going to jump to is, as we look more at software and the SaaS world, I immediately started thinking through kind of Hussein in your world, right? Is what companies and what stakeholders are thinking when they think moving to the cloud or getting best value out of it, and how that impacts all the other pieces in their environment. What are you hearing from like the customers you guys are working with? How has that conversation shifted as the threat landscape has continued to evolve over the last year when it comes to software and vulnerability? I'm curious your take on if that's something that you find penetrating the conversation or if it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can't really have the cloud migration or cloud modernization conversation without talking about SaaS. And I think that early on, a decade ago, when we first started moving data centers to Azure, it was more about like, let's get everything out of the data center and move it, right? And there was a lot of legacy applications. Some of them were, COTS off the shelf, things that people bought. Some of them were custom written. They were sitting on servers. And a lot of that stuff was kind of garbage in, garbage out. It was garbage in the data center. You move it to the cloud, it's garbage there, and it's still insecure. And I think there was also this assumption that, if you put it in the cloud, all of a sudden it's secure now. And we're like, no, it's the same junk that you guys had in the data center. And if you got that stuff open to the internet, just like you had it in the data center, it's going to be just as vulnerable. So honestly, a lot of the conversation is like, let's get away from that stuff, and let's move solutions to SaaS as much as possible. But the flip side of that is you need to trust the SaaS provider, right? And that's the other conversation that we're having more and more these days, especially with software supply chain issues. I think there's a lot less trust these days, especially from large corporate clients that we work with, to just say, oh, well, it's a SaaS provider. They're dealing with the infrastructure. They deal with the security. They have their third-party audits and their attestations, right? But then we see what happens with that. All these SaaS providers over the last few years, many of them have been exploited. Many of them have leaked customer data. I'm not going to name any names, but it's even some of the platforms that we use to communicate with one another that we might be using in this very moment have been topics of conversation around, is this SaaS provider that we're trusting with the holy grail of our data? It could be ERP, financial data, human resources data about their employees. Like, are they really keeping this stuff secure? So there's kind of two sides to the coin. One side is, do we really want to be building software in our own, cloud environment? The other side is, well, do we necessarily trust every SaaS provider out there? I don't know that there's really a clear answer to that. You really have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, Hussein, and I didn't mean to jump ahead, Jeremy. The thing that you bring up essentially boils down to compliance doesn't mean secure. All of the companies that, if you go back over 2023, and there have been a number of breaches that happened, whether it be ransomware or customer data that was, stolen, exfiltrated, all of those companies had some type of compliance in place. And one of the things that we tell our clients here is, just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure, but if you are secure, you're always compliant. And so going the extra step, going above and beyond, is always worth it if you are truly a shop that's wanting to be secure.
Bilal, what's your take from the federal perspective? I know you've held many different roles from a leadership standpoint, lots going on. Where does this place in your priorities heading into 2024? How does software supply chain and this conversation fit into the things you're thinking about these days?
Sure, absolutely. No different than AI, right? Supply chain is not necessarily a newer conversation, but based on some of the breaches that have happened over the past years, it's definitely something that's been thrown out into the forefront, right? So and Erik touched on this from a compliance standpoint, right? We always had security controls in place for supply chain, but now the NIST 853 publication 853 Rev 5. It's now a whole new control family within that, right? And now, such as the department that I'm currently at, we've created a whole new supply chain risk management program, right? So it's not good enough, as Hussein mentioned, to say, oh, this SaaS offering, they had to have gone through some type of supply chain risk management assessment. But now we've stood up our own program to say, hey, anything we're going to be purchasing or procuring moving forward, if it's not something that has been previously vetted through our supply chain risk management program, we are now going through and kind of doing that due diligence ourselves to kind of prevent some of the breaches that we've seen past couple of years.
I think that's a excellent point, Bilal, because I don't think most organizations are taking that next step, right? I think it's going to be more and more necessary, especially with organizations like NTIS and large government organizations where they have incredibly sensitive data that they're managing, both internally and for their customers. And so, I think the days of like seeing a little badge in the corner of the website that says, we have this compliance standard that we've been audited against, or we have this, security standard that we meet, is no longer good enough, right? You need to take that next step. And we've been asking questions, right? Even with SaaS providers that we're vetting for our customers, right? We say, okay, well, you have the little badge, but can you explain, right, how this works? Explain how you're protecting, this particular component of your solution. And if they can't explain it or provide documentation that explains it, it's sort of a non-starter at that point.
Yeah, and it goes.
You're in the sorry, Chris. I know saying you're in the the FedRAMP space, right? Not just because a product is FedRAMP doesn't necessarily mean it's gone through the rigorous, as you mentioned, right, supply chain risk management assessment. But I now think the FedRAMP program is catching up to that. Sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're totally fine. I think it's initially we saw the industry have a false sense of security with SaaS in particular. They think, oh, the supplier, the vendor in this case, is doing all these things for me. I have essentially no responsibility. But you still own things like access control, permissions, least permissive access. Where you put the data, who has access to it, and then we're seeing some agencies even go beyond that and start integrating tooling like SaaS security posture management to actually start to monitor these environments for configuration changes or compliance alignment, as well as start to integrate with things like federated identity providers at the agency and start to get visibility of the logs, from the SaaS provider. So, when you do have an incident, you're at least prepared to understand what environment it has impacted, what data is in that environment, moving beyond just the FedRAMP kind of compliance, as well as moving towards more of a continuous monitoring aspect, which I know we talked about continuous authorization. It's the same thing in the SaaS and cloud context. Just reviewing a subset of controls, 33% of them once a year, and calling it a day is not a sufficient approach no longer.
Chris, that's a perfect segue, actually. And speaking to folks that are tuning in, we're going to run for another topic, and then we'll open it up to some questions. I don't want us to run long, respect everybody's time, but I do like our ability to go deep enough into topics. So if you guys have a couple extra minutes on the back end at 12, just let me know and we can coordinate. But start thinking through the questions. Also, the chat should be open if you would like to use it. But on that line of continuous authorization, right, it's picking up momentum. And it's a topic that I think, and Chris, I'll go to you to kind of open things up. It's still evolving, but with the advancements in AI, data analysis, and many different tools, the adoption is growing. Talk to me about your current take on continuous authorization, the state of where it's at in its evolution, and kind of the role it plays in the next chapter of security.
Yeah, I think it's definitely evolved. It's kind of got a start initially in the DoD and the Air Force, with places like Castle Run, and now other software factories have adopted, as well as federal civilian agencies are trying to push for continuous authorization, continuous ATO, or ongoing authorization, as it's often called. But it's just kind of this recognition that the legacy, kind of snapshot based in time approach, like you talked about with a pen test, same thing we do with ATOs or RMF and FedRAMP, of just reviewing a subset of controls once a year. And I always kind of consider it similar to, like, I have 4 kids. Like, if I check their room and tell them and it's clean, right? If I come back in a day or 2 days, like, that's no assurance that in a year, that it's been clean and, from the last time I looked at it. So we're starting to leverage things like automation, APIs, cloud native services, as well as CI/CD pipelines, to start to get more of a continuous approach to authorization and continuous monitoring of these environments. The attacker doesn't just say, oh, they did their con they checked 33% of the controls, like they're good for a year. It doesn't really work like that. And now technologies like AI, like automation, like pipelines, and things like that, cloud native services from the large CSPs are starting to let us iteratively in near real time assess these environments, at least from the technical control perspective. You can't automate everything, but you can automate quite a bit. And I think we're seeing the industry move in that direction. Federal agencies start to move towards that. And I think we'll likely see FedRAMP try to move in that direction too. But one thing I did want to say is, like, I think some people think of it as an easy button. Like, I can do this to get out of doing compliance or get out of doing ATOs, but really it's actually a more mature implementation of an ATO. You require a level of rigor and visibility and ongoing monitoring that you simply haven't had in legacy ATO type approaches. So I think we have a long way to go still, but it's definitely more of a promising approach that aligns with the threat landscape.
Chris,
Jeremy,
that,
if I can jump in,
please.
and Chris, you hit the nail right on the head, right? If we kind of rewind to where ATOs first started, in that an assessment would be done once every 3 years, and the documentation was not looked at, or the security might not have been looked at for a whole 3 years prior to somebody coming in and independently assessing those controls, to now, as you mentioned, going through and assessing a subset of controls. I think you mentioned 33% every year, but now taking that kind of a step further. And what are you doing kind of in between, right? You mentioned, you gave the perfect example of your kids, and you tell them to clean your room, if you were to come back, 2 days later, is it going to be in the same state? IT cybersecurity is no different, right? So from the point of the assessment, what are we doing after that to ensure, the continuous monitoring of the information system, with the development and the expansion of the CDM program, right? So now we are automatically, as you mentioned, some of the automation, we're now automatically reporting some of the software and vulnerability configuration, the software and vulnerability management of those assets, and how the automation now will assist us in continuously monitoring, the information systems, and not just in between assessments, but now what are the logs we are going to be continuously monitoring, right? In between, what are our cyber defenses and our incident response teams going to be looking at throughout the year, and not just relying on kind of that snapshot, point in time assessment of the information system, but how the information system is going to be continuously monitored moving forward. I think you hit the nail right on the head.
Hussein, talk to me about how this applies in the world of the cloud. Are you seeing this as something that's going to prove relevant? Is it an ancillary item that you're less concerned with? I'd love your take on it, and then Erik will round it out.
Yeah, it's funny. I started my career consulting to the government. Actually, I spent quite a bit of time at NTIS, Bilal, so we have something in common. I was there as a consultant for several years, and that's where I first learned about POAMs, or plan of action and milestones. And so, to everything that you just mentioned and Chris just mentioned, it brings back a lot of memories and a lot of nightmares, actually, of, like, we have this giant assessment, we got all this whole list of, like, here are all the things we're going to fix, and we're going to fix these in 3 months, and these in 6 months, and these in 9 months. And then someone just stuck it in, like, a file folder somewhere and just didn't look at it for a year. And so translating that to, spending more of our time on commercial clients these days, it's not all that different. It's just, I think that there's a lot of tools now that are sold to CIOs and CTOs and CISOs that say, we're going to manage this for you, right? The Tenables, the Rapid7s of the world do a really great job of marketing this stuff to IT leadership, and they say, okay, I'm going to buy this thing, I'm going to put it in, and then it's going to assess our environment. We're going to scan every single day. It's going to create tickets for our security staff and our administrators to work on. but it just ends up becoming so much noise. And I think, not to harp on AI too much, I think really this is where AI from the security perspective is going to help quite a bit in alleviating just the noise, right? Because every customer we work with, they just don't have enough resources to deal with all the noise that all these tools are creating. And then something bad happens and the CEO or the CIO is just like, but we spent all this money on this thing that was supposed to prevent that from happening. And then you open the thing and like, there's literally a million lines of alerts that have never been addressed. And it's just like, who has time to do that, right? You got like one guy off in the corner who's just like sweating and freaking out, who hasn't slept, in a year. And he's just like, I'm going to lose my job, right? And this is, I think, it becomes this like vicious cycle of people don't even want to get into cyber now because they're so scared of becoming that person, right? Like I heard a stat recently that like cyber professionals in the whole landscape of IT have the highest anxiety and depression levels. Why do you think that is? It's just too much, right? And so hopefully going into next year with tools like Copilot for security, and I'm sure a lot of other tools that other vendors will develop with similar logic will help to reduce the noise and make these cyber professionals' lives a little bit easier is what I'm hoping for.
Anyway. Not to open up another can of worms on predictions, but I think he's spot on. Like I read some studies and reports, and the numbers vary, but like it said, like the average organization has over 70 security tools. And people are trying to monitor these, and like not only that, but like actually implement and configure them. Maybe you bought something, right? But has it actually been tuned for your environment? Is someone actively monitoring it? Has it been configured appropriately to be effective? And then also there's a marketing aspect of someone says, oh, we bought Zero Trust or we bought DevSecOps. Like these are methodologies and mindsets that you can't just purchase off the shelf. It's a way of operating. The tool can help, but it's not the end all be all. So I think in going into next year, we're going to see AI play a part in terms of automation, but also maybe some rationalization around tooling and trying to get, clear up some of the noise and maybe move towards more bigger platform type products that bring together various capabilities, things like that I think are definitely going to occur too.
I'm curious to open up one question and then to the audience, if you guys have any questions, and then we'll kind of tie things out. It might be a couple minutes over noon. If you guys have a hard stop, please let me know. I want to respect your time. There's the technical nuances of everything we're talking about, technical challenges associated with performing these responsibilities. And then there's the cultural part, the organizational part. How do organizations go into 2024, whether it's federal or it's on the commercial side, on the private side? What's going to prove to be the more complicated part from your point of view? Is it technically this is a challenging thing to leverage AI or to do things in a way that is commensurate with the state of software supply chain and vulnerable? Or is it the cultural side, the mindset part of how do we change how people think about things? Chris, I see you nodding along. Why don't you pick up and run with it? I'm just curious if we look out, what's the thing that's going to ultimately prove to be the greater adversary for us getting out of our own way?
Yeah, it's kind of an easy softball question because I'm sure almost everyone who is on this call here would agree that if they worked in large, heavily regulated, complex environments, it's never the technology that's the problem. It's almost always the cultural, the workforce, the internal politics, the people aspect of things that's more complicated to navigate. So just trying to, in terms of like updating and upskilling workforces, modernizing internal organizational policies and processes, just ways of operating is going to be what's the challenge, not, leveraging AI from a technological perspective. It's going to be the people aspect, the process, the policy.
Any insight into how people get out of that, how they overcome that, right? Especially in large organizations where you have hundreds, thousands of employees, it can take years to truly change that same thing of you can't, cATO on a train really. Like, you can't just take a left. You have to gradually move things. Organizations, they're big ships. They take time to start to change course. How do we set ourselves in the right direction?
Yeah, I think at least. Sorry, was that question for Erik?
No, go for it.
So I think at least and I'll be quick. What we're seeing is change management is such a critical aspect of this. And, most organizations don't do change management well. They don't invest in it. They don't really take it seriously, but the ones that do are going to be the ones that win going into next year. And I think, just making the tools accessible is one piece, right? Like not starting with something that's hyper complex and super like nebulous for regular non-technical people to understand is one piece. But the other piece is going to be really good training, actually spending time with folks, face to face, hands on keyboard, showing them what they can do with the tools is going to be super, super critical. So the folks that do provide training and change management are going to be very busy next year, hopefully. But I'll pass the mic to Erik. Sorry.
Not a problem at all, man. I think one of the ways that we can combat that is through gamification. One of the things that's dear to my heart that I've contributed in the past is CTFs. And when you bring a CTF into an organization and let them play with the technology that you're wanting to use, if it's AI, put them in front of some AI and have them solve some challenges, some puzzles. Let them see what it is, see how to manipulate it. Because right now, especially with AI, one of the big fears that a lot of people have is it's going to steal my job, and when people are scared of it, then they instantly they push it away, they fear it. You see that a lot, with organizations blocking ChatGPT. And having hackathons, CTF, stuff like that. Those are great training for the end user, and honestly for the person who is building them. If you're a technical type person, you learn just as much, if not more, while building it as you do performing in it. Like I thoroughly enjoy building CTFs for new people that are coming into the cybersecurity space. So that's how I think is one way of combating the cultural aspect. Now in terms of the technology aspect, unfortunately, it's a very easy fix, but one that's also very difficult, and that's for the leaders. Open your pocketbook. AI is not going to be cheap. It is what it is, but if you can get past that part, I think it'll pay dividends in the end.
It's a great point. Virgil, I saw you drop the comment. I think it's really interesting for those that have checked it out. I don't know if there's an additional question or a thought you wanted to expand on. I'll wait to see if there's a response there. While we're kind of getting some feedback, it doesn't look like tons of questions coming through. I'd love to take a couple minutes and go around the horn for panelists just to kind of closing thoughts. What's top of mind for you heading into the new year? Things that maybe we can take away as far as things to keep in mind, advice to stakeholders, kind of general closing thoughts. I'll start with Chris. What you got going on today? What's top of mind heading into the new year? Closing thoughts for us.
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot of it, honestly. It's like, keeping an eye on the evolving use cases and adoption of AI and generative AI in the federal landscape, as well as commercial companies looking to innovate and provide visibility of shadow AI usage, for example, as well as integrating AI capabilities into things like, SIEM and SOC type environments, as well as secure coding and software development practices. I'm definitely keeping an eye on the software supply chain aspect with OMB memos and self-attestations of suppliers signed to the federal government. Interested to see where FedRAMP modernization goes, given the memo out there, see how much actually occurs versus what was in the memo. It's easy to write a memo. Implementation is always a lot harder. And then last but not least, I'm excited to see the evolution of the vulnerability management landscape, things like SysACAV and EPSS, and starting to lean towards more contextualization of vulnerabilities that we've talked about that's important for things like FedRAMP, but also pen testing, or just working in a DevSecOps environment, trying to minimize toil and drive down organizational risk. So we've touched on a lot, and all these things are going to be present and top of mind going into the new year.
I love it. Yeah, I know we didn't get to touch too heavily on zero trust. I wanted to get into FedRAMP and NIST adoption and kind of what that's going to do for things. But I guess maybe next year we earmark 90 minutes instead of 60. But Bilal, top of mind for you right now heading into the new year, maybe thoughts for other folks in federal leadership as far as how they can maybe pick up some of the learnings from this year heading into new year. Just unpack for us as closing thoughts.
Sure, absolutely. And piggybacking literally on everything all the panelists said, and what Chris just mentioned, right? In terms of obviously, as again, all the panelists mentioned, AI is not going anywhere, right? So trying to figure out the solution moving forward on, one, how we use AI, for our benefit, and to protect us against, cyber actors and malicious threats. to ensuring that the AI we use is obviously secure. And we talk about ad nauseum on this call in terms of supply chain risk management. And you touched on another topic as well that we didn't get to touch on today. Hopefully, maybe sometime in the future. But in terms of zero trust, right? I know Chris mentioned there's no one-stop shop in terms of I purchased zero trust, right? Or there's no one tool to say I went out and procured this tool and now I've implemented zero trust, right? There's no such thing. There's no one-stop shop for zero trust to kind of satisfy all the requirements across all the different all the 5 pillars of zero trust. So the continued implementation of zero trust, like I mentioned, across those 5 pillars is something we're going to be looking to continue to tackle moving forward into 2024.
Love it. Erik, and then I'll go to you, Hussein, to close this out, and everybody in the comments, Virgil, Bonnie, thank you guys for showing some love. I will say separately, would love some feedback directly. This is the first time we've done this. We'll do many next year. It's not going to be perfect, but I would love some feedback as far as things that you like that you took away that like, hey, let's do that again. And then other things that maybe, hey, if we did this, it might provide a different angle. If we do many, we can test, and it can be iterative as far as what the next one goes. Erik, top of mind for you in closing thoughts, wrap it up 23, heading into 24, and then Hussein to close us out from there.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. I would say the biggest thing that's coming for us in 24 is and I believe it was Bilal and Chris that both mentioned the NIST 853 R5. That contains a red team component that's going to be coming into FedRAMP. The red teaming aspect is going to be something that's huge, in my opinion. It's going to change the landscape of a lot of what FedRAMP is doing, how it's protected, and going on what we were talking about earlier as for the next step, because Bilal had mentioned this and it really resonated within me when he said, how do you check everything that's going on? And this also touches on Virgil's question in chat. And that's one of the things is purple teaming. And that is, we have a red team situation that's going on, and a lot of our clients right now utilize us for purple teaming, which is essentially we continue to push the red button until they get the alerts that signify that they are safe. It's an exercise. It does take a lot of extra effort. But for those clients, it is huge, and they are going to be the ones that are leaps and bounds ahead of the curve come 2024 when red teaming for FedRAMP comes into play.
Love it.
Erik, I look forward to being customers of that.
Looking forward to it.
Hussein, take us home, and then I'll wrap us up and send us on our way.
Yeah, no, I just want to first say thank you, Jeremy, for putting this on. This has been awesome. I don't do a ton of these things, but we did the podcast just a few weeks back, and that was a good time, and we had great feedback, and it's great obviously to meet the rest of the panelists here. Tons of respect, and looking forward to hopefully connecting with you guys offline. But not to end on a scary or somber note, but I do think going into an election year and with the emergence of AI, we need to be hyper vigilant about what that means for voter manipulation, for spreading bias, for spreading disinformation, right? It's never been easier for the bots that exist on every social media website in the millions, right, to feed people information that could sway them one way or another, and to really understand the leanings that create echo chambers on these platforms by just feeding people information that just gets them more and more riled up. And so I'm definitely, I'm concerned. I think we should all be concerned, but I think, as leaders in technology, it's our responsibility to, one, be able to spot these things, two, to, inform our friends and family and colleagues that this is coming, and just to be hyper vigilant about not getting caught in these echo chambers that are very likely to only become louder and louder and louder going into November of next year. So overall, I'm very positive going into 2024. I think there's a ton of opportunity, and I think we're all going to be very busy, and hopefully busy in the right ways. And I'm excited for what's to come. So thanks again, Jeremy, for inviting me to be part of this.
Everybody, thank you for sharing some time this morning with us. This will be live, so that for those that are checking this out in the replay, thank you for stopping in later. But this will go live on YouTube probably back end of next week. There will be a blog that goes deeper into the details of it, kind of links some other resources. But Chris Hughes, Bilal, Baisa, Erik, Dominguez, Hussein Sharaf, thank you all for sharing time with us and your insights. Everybody else, you know the deal, whether it's podcast, this or the events, we'll be back with more before long. So thank you guys. Enjoy your Friday and your weekend as well.
Thanks, everybody.
See
Have
you
a good
guys.
weekend.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.